The birth of the Iron Curtain. Europe in 1945 was a continent exhausted to its core. Cities lay in ruins, economies had collapsed, and tens of millions were dead or displaced. The Second World War had ended not with clarity, but with uncertainty. The old European order had been shattered, and in its place stood two victorious powers whose visions for the future could not be reconciled. On one side was the United States, emerging from the war with its industrial base intact, its economy booming, and its confidence in liberal democracy strengthened. On the other was the Soviet Union, victorious yet traumatized, having lost more than 20 million citizens and seen entire regions reduced to ashes. Both powers claimed to have saved Europe. Both believed their system was the only path to lasting peace, and both were deeply suspicious of the other. The Iron Curtain did not fall suddenly. It descended slowly, quietly and almost invisibly, shaped by fear, ideology, memory, and power. The roots of the division can be traced back long before the war ended. Relations between Western democracies and Soviet communism had always been uneasy. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had introduced a radically different political system, one that rejected capitalism, private property, and pluralist democracy. Western governments viewed the Soviet experiment with suspicion, even hostility. The Soviets, in turn, believed the capitalist world was determined to destroy their revolution. During World War II, necessity forced cooperation. Nazi Germany posed an existential threat to both sides, and survival demanded alliance. Yet even as American, British, and Soviet forces fought a common enemy, mistrust never disappeared. Each side watched the other carefully, already thinking about the world that would emerge once the war was over. As Allied armies advanced across Europe in the final years of the war, geography began to shape destiny. Soviet forces liberated or conquered Eastern Europe as they pushed westward. American and British troops advanced from the west and south. Where these armies stopped would determine the political future of entire nations. This reality was quietly acknowledged at wartime conferences. At Yalta in February 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met to discuss the post-war settlement. Publicly, they spoke of democracy, free elections, and collective security. Privately, each leader understood that power on the ground mattered more than promises on paper. Stalin made his position clear through actions rather than words. The Soviet Union had been invaded twice through Eastern Europe in less than 30 years, first by Germany in World War I, then again in World War II. To Soviet leaders, security meant control. Friendly governments along their western border were not a luxury, they were a necessity. As Red Army troops occupied Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and later Eastern Germany, Soviet-backed administrations began to take shape. At first, these governments often included non-communist parties, giving the appearance of political pluralism. But this was temporary. Behind the scenes, communist leaders, trained in Moscow and supported by Soviet security forces, worked systematically to eliminate rivals. Opposition politicians were harassed, arrested, or discredited. Independent newspapers were shut down or taken over. Elections were manipulated, and when that was not enough, they were simply ignored. By the late 1940s, one country after another had become a one-party state aligned firmly with Moscow. In Western Europe, a different path was unfolding. War damage was severe, but political institutions remained largely intact. With American support, democratic governments rebuilt their economies and reaffirmed civil liberties. The United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1947, offering billions of dollars in aid to help Europe recover. The program was not purely humanitarian, it was also strategic. Economic stability, American leaders believed, would prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan outright and forbade Eastern European countries from participating. To Moscow, the plan was not aid but influence, an attempt by the United States to draw Europe into its economic and political orbit. The refusal hardened the divide. Economic cooperation across the continent became impossible. Two separate systems began to take shape, facing each other with growing suspicion. It was in this tense atmosphere that Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister, but still a towering global figure, delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946. Standing beside U.S. President Harry Truman, Churchill warned the world of a new reality. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase captured what many already sensed but had not yet named. Europe was no longer merely rebuilding, it was being divided, politically, militarily, economically, and ideologically. Churchill's speech was met with mixed reactions. In the West, many saw it as a necessary warning. In the Soviet Union, it was denounced as warmongering. Stalin compared Churchill to Hitler, accusing him of calling for conflict between East and West. The war of words signaled a deeper conflict that was no longer hidden behind diplomatic language. Despite the rhetoric, there was still no physical barrier stretching across Europe. No wall, no fence, no continuous line on the ground. Yet the Iron Curtain was already real in the lives of millions. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence reshaped everyday existence. Political loyalty became a matter of survival. Education systems were rewritten to reflect Marxist-Leninist ideology. History was retold, emphasizing class struggle and Soviet heroism while erasing inconvenient truths. Churches were monitored, sometimes suppressed. The secret police became a constant presence, cultivating fear and compliance. In Western Europe, the memory of fascism fueled a renewed commitment to democratic values. Free press, competitive elections, and open debate were restored. At the same time, fear of communism influenced politics. Communist parties, though sometimes popular for their role in resistance movements, were increasingly viewed with suspicion. The division was not only external, it shaped internal political life on both sides. Germany became the central symbol of this split. Defeated, occupied, and divided into zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, Germany embodied Europe's uncertain future. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, was itself divided among the four powers. Cooperation there was fragile from the start. By 1948, tensions reached a breaking point. Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones, aiming to stabilize the economy. The Soviet Union responded by cutting off all land access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out. The Berlin blockade was a dramatic escalation, a test of resolve. Rather than retreat, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. Planes landed every few minutes, delivering food, fuel, and medicine to more than 2 million people. The blockade ultimately failed, but the message was clear. Cooperation had given way to confrontation. In 1949, Germany was formally divided into two states. The Federal Republic of Germany in the West aligned with the United States and Western Europe. The German Democratic Republic in the East became a Soviet satellite state. What had once been a temporary occupation became a permanent division. That same year, NATO was formed, binding Western Europe and North America into a military alliance. The Soviet Union would later respond with its own bloc. The Iron Curtain was no longer just political, it was military. By the early 1950s, Europe stood frozen between two worlds. Movement across borders became increasingly restricted. Trade declined. Communication was filtered through propaganda. Families were separated not only by geography, but by ideology. To cross from one side to the other required permission that was rarely granted. The Iron Curtain had descended without a single declaration of war, without a treaty formally dividing the continent. It emerged instead from fear, power, and the unresolved trauma of war. What began as a security strategy became a system of control. What was justified as protection became a source of oppression for millions. Yet at this stage, the division was still incomplete. Resistance simmered beneath the surface. Cracks existed within the system. And nowhere was the tension more concentrated than in the city of Berlin, where the invisible line would soon become concrete. The story of the Iron Curtain is not only about governments and ideology. It is about ordinary people adapting to extraordinary constraints. It is about choices made under pressure and consequences that lasted generations. As the Cold War deepened, the curtain would harden, transforming from a metaphor into walls, fences, and armed borders. This was only the beginning. Consolidation, control, and the hardening of the divide. By the early 1950s, The Iron Curtain was no longer an abstract political concept. It had become a lived reality enforced through institutions, borders, and fear. What began as Soviet influence gradually transformed into a tightly controlled system that reshaped Eastern Europe from the ground up. The Cold War had entered a new phase, not one of open battle in Europe, but of consolidation, surveillance, and psychological warfare. In Eastern Europe, communist governments moved quickly to eliminate any remaining ambiguity about power. Coalition politics disappeared. Communist parties absorbed or outlawed rivals, rewriting constitutions to guarantee their dominance. Power flowed upward, to party leadership, and ultimately to Moscow. The tools of control were systematic and relentless. Secret police organizations became the backbone of the new order. In East Germany, the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, developed one of the most intrusive surveillance networks in modern history. In Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, similar agencies monitored citizens, infiltrated workplaces, churches, and even families. Trust eroded as neighbors became informants and private conversations carried risks. Arrests often occurred at night. Trials, when they happened at all, were staged. Confessions were extracted through psychological pressure and physical abuse. Charges were vague: anti-state activity, bourgeois nationalism, or counter-revolutionary thought. Guilt was assumed, innocence was irrelevant. The purpose was not only punishment, but deterrence. Fear itself became a form of governance. Economic life also changed dramatically. Industries were nationalized, land collectivized, and central planning introduced. The promise was equality and abundance. The reality was inefficiency, shortages, and stagnation. While some benefited, especially party loyalists, many experienced declining living standards. Yet public criticism was dangerous. Propaganda filled the gap between promise and reality. Education became a crucial battleground. Schools taught Marxist-Leninist doctrine as unquestionable truth. History books were rewritten to portray the Soviet Union as Europe's liberator and moral guide. Western democracies were depicted as exploitative, decadent, and on the brink of collapse. Children learned early that loyalty to the party mattered more than independent thought. Religion posed a particular challenge. Churches commanded deep loyalty in many Eastern European societies, especially in Poland. Communist governments responded with surveillance, harassment, and in some cases imprisonment of clergy. While religion was not always banned outright, it was tightly controlled, marginalized, and portrayed as incompatible with socialist progress. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, a different transformation was underway. The Marshall Plan accelerated recovery, rebuilding infrastructure and stabilizing currencies. Factories reopened, trade revived, consumer goods returned to shop windows. Economic growth fostered political stability, and democratic institutions gained renewed legitimacy. This contrast was not accidental. Western leaders understood that prosperity was a weapon in the ideological struggle. Every refrigerator, automobile, and television set became silent propaganda, symbols of capitalism's promise. Cultural influence flowed alongside economic aid. Music, films, fashion, and advertising projected an image of freedom and abundance. But the West was not without fear. Communist parties remained influential in countries like France and Italy. Labor unrest, decolonization, and economic inequality fueled anxieties about internal subversion. Anti-communism shaped domestic politics, sometimes leading to repression of its own. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and surveillance existed on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Though the scale and severity differed greatly, the division of Europe hardened further with the creation of opposing military alliances. NATO represented a formal commitment to collective defense in the West. Though framed as defensive, it was perceived in Moscow as encirclement. The Soviet response would come later with the Warsaw Pact. But even before then, Eastern Europe was effectively militarized. Borders became more rigid. Travel restrictions tightened. Barbed wire and guard towers appeared along frontiers separating East from West. The flow of people slowed to a trickle. Those who fled risked their lives, and those who remained behind were often punished collectively. Jobs lost, families harassed, futures closed off. Yet despite the repression, resistance never disappeared entirely. In 1953, East Germany erupted in protests sparked by increased work quotas and economic hardship. Workers took to the streets demanding reforms. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising within days. The message was unmistakable. Dissent would not be tolerated. 3 years later, Hungary would go further. In 1956, popular unrest escalated into a full-scale revolt against communist rule. Protesters demanded free elections, withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, and an end to Soviet domination. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Iron Curtain might crack. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. Tanks rolled into Budapest. Thousands were killed. The revolution was crushed and Hungary was forced back into the Soviet orbit. The West watched, protested, but did not intervene. The limits of resistance and of Western support were laid bare. Each suppressed uprising reinforced the reality of division. Eastern Europe learned that the Soviet Union would use force to maintain control. Western Europe learned that liberation would not come through direct confrontation without risking nuclear war. Nuclear weapons loomed constantly in the background. The arms race intensified, transforming fear into a permanent condition. Mutually assured destruction ensured that direct war remained unthinkable, even as tensions escalated. Europe became the central chessboard in a global standoff where escalation could mean annihilation. Berlin remained the most volatile point. Though divided, movement between East and West Berlin was still possible in the 1950s. Thousands fled each month from East Germany through the city, seeking freedom and opportunity in the West. The loss embarrassed the East German government and threatened its economic viability. The solution would be drastic. In August 1961, East German authorities, backed by the Soviet Union, began erecting barriers across Berlin. Streets were torn apart. Barbed wires stretched across neighborhoods. Within days, concrete walls followed. Families were separated overnight. Windows overlooking the West were bricked up. Guards were ordered to shoot escapees. The Berlin Wall transformed the Iron Curtain into an unmistakable physical reality. No longer invisible, no longer metaphorical, it stood as proof that the division of Europe was being enforced at gunpoint. Western leaders condemned the wall, but again, no military response followed. The wall was brutal, but it stabilized the Cold War order. Escape slowed dramatically. The East German state survived. The division endured. For ordinary Europeans, life settled into a strange normalcy. Two Europes developed side by side, sharing geography but not experience. In the West, travel expanded, economies integrated, and democratic norms deepened. In the East, conformity ensured survival, and private life shrank under public scrutiny. Yet beneath the surface, contradictions accumulated. Central planning failed to deliver sustained growth. Environmental degradation worsened. Cynicism spread as propaganda lost credibility. The gap between East and West widened, visible even through tightly controlled media. The Iron Curtain appeared solid, immovable, permanent. But history has a way of eroding even the strongest structures. By the late 1960s and 1970s, subtle changes began to emerge. Reforms, dissent, cultural shifts, and economic pressures that would slowly weaken the system from within. The curtain still stood, but its foundations were no longer unchallenged. And at its heart, Berlin remained both symbol and fault line, a city where the Cold War could be seen, touched, and felt every day.
By the late 1960s, the Iron Curtain had been standing for more than 2 decades. For a generation of Europeans, division was no longer a shocking outcome of war. It was the only reality they had ever known. Children born after 1945 grew up on opposite sides of the same continent, learning different histories, speaking the same languages under different meanings, and imagining futures shaped by systems they did not choose. In Eastern Europe, daily life was defined by accommodation. Most people were not revolutionaries, nor were they enthusiastic supporters of the regime. They learned to adapt, to comply outwardly while guarding private thoughts. Survival required understanding the rules of an unwritten social contract, public loyalty, private silence. Workplaces were tied to the state. Employment was guaranteed, but advancement depended on political reliability as much as competence. Party membership opened doors, better housing, travel permits, access to scarce goods. Refusal closed them. This created a culture of quiet compromise, where many joined not out of belief, but necessity. Housing shortages were common. Families waited years for apartments, often living in cramped, decaying buildings. Consumer goods existed, but choice was limited. Long queues became part of daily routine. A new refrigerator or car was not a matter of money alone, but of connections and patience. Scarcity bred improvisation and resentment. Yet life was not uniformly bleak. Education was widely accessible, and literacy rates were high. Women participated in the workforce at unprecedented levels. Basic health care was available to all. The state provided security, but at the cost of freedom. The omnipresence of surveillance shaped behavior in subtle ways. Conversations were cautious, jokes were coded, children were warned not to repeat certain remarks at school. The boundary between public and private narrowed, forcing people to internalize restraint. Fear was not always visible, but it was pervasive. In contrast, Western Europe underwent a cultural and economic transformation. The post-war boom fueled consumerism, urbanization, and mobility. Television brought the world into living rooms. Youth culture flourished. Music, fashion, and protest movements challenged traditional authority. Yet the Cold War was never far from daily consciousness. Air raid drills, nuclear shelters, and civil defense campaigns reminded citizens that peace was fragile. The threat of annihilation coexisted with prosperity, creating a peculiar tension between optimism and dread. Propaganda flowed in both directions. Eastern European media portrayed the West as morally corrupt, divided by inequality and exploitation. Western broadcasts emphasized repression, shortages, and lack of freedom in the East. Radio became a critical medium. Stations like Radio Free Europe transmitted news and cultural programming across borders, often at great personal risk to listeners. Sports, culture, and science became arenas of competition. Olympic medals were celebrated as ideological victories. Space exploration symbolized technological superiority. Even chess matches carried political weight. Success was framed not as individual achievement, but as proof of systemic excellence. Despite restrictions, information seeped through. Western music circulated on smuggled tapes. Fashion trends crossed borders through travelers and television signals. Tourists glimpsed alternative realities, returning home with stories that contradicted official narratives. These small cracks mattered. In 1968, Czechoslovakia attempted to reform from within. Under Alexander Dubček, the government introduced a program of socialism with a human face, loosening censorship and allowing limited political pluralism. For a brief moment, it appeared possible to reconcile socialism with freedom. The experiment alarmed Moscow. In August, Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia, crushing the Prague Spring. Once again, tanks silenced reform. The lesson was enforced. Deviation would not be tolerated. Yet repression came at a cost. Each intervention eroded the moral authority of communist leadership. Cynicism deepened. Belief faded. Compliance remained, but enthusiasm vanished. In the 1970s, the Cold War entered a phase of détente. Tensions eased slightly. Arms control agreements were signed. Trade increased. Travel restrictions loosened marginally. For some, this raised hopes of lasting change. But détente did not dismantle the Iron Curtain. It merely softened its edges. Dissident movements gained strength, especially among intellectuals, writers, and artists. In Poland, worker protests combined with religious identity to form a powerful opposition. The election of a Polish pope in 1978 electrified the region, demonstrating that moral authority could exist outside state control. Meanwhile, Western Europe moved toward deeper integration. Economic cooperation expanded into political coordination. The European community laid the groundwork for a future beyond nationalism and war. This process reinforced the contrast with the fragmented, rigid systems of the East. Berlin remained the most potent symbol of division. The wall became normalized, graffiti covered on the western side, stark and lethal on the eastern. Escape attempts continued, some successful, many fatal. Each one carried enormous symbolic weight. Families adapted to separation. Visits were rare and monitored. Letters were censored. Phone calls were brief. The emotional toll was immense, yet often hidden beneath routine. By the late 1970s, the Iron Curtain appeared stable. But signs of strain multiplied. Economic stagnation deepened. Environmental disasters were concealed. Young people grew disillusioned. The system survived, but increasingly through inertia rather than conviction. The Cold War in Europe had become a paradox, rigid yet fragile, oppressive yet dependent on compliance, powerful yet internally hollow. The stage was set for transformation. What remained was the spark that would turn quiet dissatisfaction into irreversible change. By the early 1980s, the Iron Curtain still stood, but it no longer inspired the same sense of permanence it once had. The walls, borders, and surveillance systems remained intact, yet the certainty that had sustained them was eroding. What had once been held together by fear and ideological conviction was now maintained largely through inertia. The system endured not because people believed in it, but because they saw no alternative. Eastern Europe was sinking into deep economic crisis. Central planning had proven incapable of adapting to technological change or global competition. Factories churned out outdated goods that few wanted, while basic necessities remained scarce. Infrastructure decayed, productivity stagnated, and environmental damage accumulated as heavy industry polluted rivers, air, and soil with little oversight. The promise that socialism would surpass capitalism increasingly rang hollow. Governments turned to Western loans to stabilize their economies, quietly undermining the claim of socialist self-sufficiency. Citizens noticed the contradiction. Even through censorship, comparisons with the West were unavoidable. Television signals crossed borders. Travelers returned with stories. The gap between official propaganda and lived reality grew too wide to ignore. The social contract that had sustained communist rule, security in exchange for obedience, began to fracture. Job guarantees meant little when wages could not cover basic needs. State housing lost its appeal as buildings deteriorated. Education offered fewer opportunities as innovation stalled. The system still controlled society, but it no longer commanded loyalty. In Poland, these pressures ignited mass resistance. With a strong national identity and deep religious roots, Polish society proved unusually resilient. In 1980, workers at the Gdansk shipyard launched strikes demanding better conditions and political reform. What followed was unprecedented. The Solidarity movement emerged as the first independent trade union in the Eastern Bloc, quickly growing into a nationwide force with millions of members. Solidarity was not limited to intellectuals or dissidents. It was a mass movement. For the first time, communist authority was challenged openly and collectively. The government responded with martial law, arrests, and censorship. Solidarity was forced underground, but it was not destroyed. Its existence alone proved that the state was not invincible. Across Eastern Europe, opposition took many forms. Writers, artists, and academics built underground networks. Samizdat publications circulated banned texts. Churches became spaces of relative freedom. Public protests remained risky, but private dissent multiplied. Each act of resistance weakened the illusion of total control. At the same time, the Soviet Union itself was changing. The generation shaped by the Second World War was aging, and younger leaders faced a stark reality. The system could not continue unchanged. Military spending drained resources. The arms race with the United States strained an already stagnant economy. The war in Afghanistan exposed the limits of Soviet power and credibility. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power with a recognition that reform was unavoidable. He introduced glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. These policies loosened censorship, allowed limited public criticism, and attempted to reform the economy. Though cautious, they represented a fundamental shift from decades of rigid control. The most importantly, Gorbachev abandoned the doctrine that had enforced the Iron Curtain through force. The Soviet Union signaled that it would no longer intervene militarily to suppress reform in Eastern Europe. This decision, more than any speech or treaty, changed the course of history. Eastern European leaders understood the implications immediately. The threat that had crushed Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 was fading. The Iron Curtain still existed, but its ultimate guarantor was stepping back. In East Germany, this shift proved decisive. The state depended heavily on surveillance and repression, but it also relied on Soviet backing. As that backing weakened, dissent grew bolder. Churches became centers of peaceful protest. Weekly prayer meetings evolved into mass demonstrations. The demands were simple but revolutionary. Freedom to travel, freedom to speak, freedom to choose. Elsewhere, reform accelerated. Hungary quietly opened its borders. Poland negotiated with solidarity, leading to semi-free elections. Communist parties fractured internally, divided between hardliners and reformers. Authority dissolved faster than anyone had anticipated. Berlin remained the focal point. The wall still stood, guarded and lethal, but it increasingly symbolized a system out of step with history. East German citizens watched events unfold across the region and concluded that change was possible and that tanks would not come. In November 1989, pressure reached a breaking point. Protests filled the streets, security forces hesitated, orders grew unclear. Fear shifted from the population to the state itself. A confused announcement about travel regulations triggered a surge of people toward the border crossings. Guards, unwilling and unable to use force, opened the gates. The Berlin Wall fell not through war or negotiation, but through collective pressure and systemic collapse. People climbed the wall, crossed freely, and embraced strangers. The images circled the world, marking the symbolic end of the Iron Curtain. What followed was rapid and irreversible. Communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed, mostly without violence. Elections were held. Borders opened. The division of Europe, imposed for nearly half a century, unraveled in a matter of months. In East Germany, reunification with the West soon followed. In 1990, Germany was formally reunited. The physical scars of division faded quickly, but the social and economic consequences did not. East German industries collapsed under competition. Unemployment soared. Entire professions vanished. Political freedom arrived swiftly, but economic equality lagged behind, leaving many disoriented and resentful. Elsewhere, transitions unfolded unevenly. Poland and Hungary moved rapidly toward democracy and market reform. Czechoslovakia split peacefully into two states. Romania's transition was violent, ending with the execution of its longtime dictator. Yugoslavia descended into war, exposing unresolved national tensions that the Cold War had suppressed rather than solved. At the center of this transformation, the Soviet Union itself unraveled. Nationalist movements surged within its republics. Economic collapse accelerated. Political legitimacy evaporated. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, formally ending the Cold War and removing the final pillar supporting the Iron Curtain. For many in the West, this moment felt like victory. Liberal democracy and capitalism appeared triumphant. A new Europe, united, peaceful, and prosperous, seemed possible. Former Eastern Bloc states sought integration into NATO and the European Union, viewing membership as protection and promise. Yet the legacy of the Iron Curtain endured. Economic disparities persisted. Migration reshaped societies. Trust in institutions remained fragile in many post-communist states. Memories of surveillance and repression lingered. The line that once divided Europe continued to influence political attitudes, social trust, and economic outcomes long after it disappeared from maps. Even today, the Iron Curtain shadow can be traced in infrastructure, voting patterns, and cultural memory. It stands as a reminder of how deeply imposed systems can shape human lives, and how fragile those systems become once belief disappears. The Iron Curtain did not fall because of a single leader or moment. It fell because millions of people stopped believing in the order that sustained it. When fear faded, the wall had nothing left to stand on. History did not end with its collapse. But a chapter closed, one written in silence, surveillance, and separation, and its echoes still shape Europe today.